We figured you might be troubled, Ty, Cap said in that dry, hard old voice. So Tom and me, we came out to see the sides were even up. You could feel the change in the air. That blonde with the scarred lip, later I found out his name was Fedderson. He didn't like the situation even a little. Here I was, dead center in front of him, but he and his two partners, they were framed by Tom Sunday and Cap Roundtree. Fedderson glanced one way and then the other, and you could just see his horns pull in. He'd come through that door, sure enough, on the prod and pond and dust, but suddenly he was so peaceful it worried me. You better hunt yourself a hole before he comes out of it, Fedderson said. He'll stretch your hide. By that time I had my pants on and was stamping into my boots. Believe me, I sure hate to face up the trouble with no pants on and no boots. So I slung my gun belt and settled my holster into place. You tell him to draw his pay and rattle his hocks out of here. I ain't hunting trouble, but he's pushing, mighty pushing. The three of us walked across to Drover's cottage for a meal, and the first thing we saw was Orrin sitting down close to that blonde girl, and she was looking at him like he was money from home. But that was the least of it. Her father was sitting there listening himself. Leave it to Orrin and that Welsh-talking tongue of his. He could talk a squirrel right out of a walnut tree. I never saw the like. The three of us sat down to a good meal, and we talked up a storm about the country to the west and the wild cattle and how much a man could make if he could keep Comanche, Kiowas, and Utes from lifting his hair. It seemed strange to be sitting at a table. We were all so used to sitting on the ground, we felt awkward with a white cloth and all. Out on the range, a man ate with his hunting knife what he could swab up with a chunk of bread. That night, Mr. Belden paid us off in the hotel office, and one by one we stepped up for our money. You got to remember that neither Orrin or me had ever had $25 of cash money in our lives before. In the mountains, a man mostly swapped for what he needed, and clothes were homespun. Our wages were $25 a month, and Orrin and me had 2 months and a part of a third coming. Only when he came to me, Mr. Belden put down his pen and sat back in his chair. Ty, he said, there's a prisoner here who is being held for the United States Marshal, brought in this morning. His name is Aiken, and he was riding with Back Rand the day you met them out on the prairie. Yes, sir. I had a talk with Aiken, and he told me that if it hadn't been for you, Back Rand would have taken my herd, or tried to. It seems, from what you said, and what he said, that you saved my herd, or saved us a nasty fight and a stampede, where I was sure to lose cattle. It seems this Aiken knew all about you, Sacketts. And he told Rand enough so that Rand didn't want to call your bluff. I'm not an ungrateful man, Ty, so I'm adding $200 to your wages. $200 was a sight of money those days, cash money being a shy thing. When we walked out on the porch of the Dover's cottage, there were 3 wagons coming up the trail, and 3 more behind them. The first 3 were army ambulances, surrounded by a dozen Mexicans in fringed buckskin suits and wide Mexican sombreros. There were another dozen riding around the 3 freight wagons following, and we'd never seen the like. Their jackets were short, only to the waist, and their pants flared out at the bottom and fitted like a glove along the thighs. Their spurs had rowels like mill wheels on them. They all had spanking new rifles and pistols. They wore colored silk sashes like some of those Texas cowhands wore. And they were all slicked out like some kind of a show. Horses? Mister, you never saw such horses. Everyone clean-limbed and quick, and everyone showing he'd been curried and fussed over. Every man-jack of that crowd was well set up, and if I ever saw a fighting crowd, it was this lot. The first carriage drew up before the drover's cottage, and a tall, fine-looking old man with pure white hair and white mustaches got down from the wagons, then helped a girl down. Now I couldn't sightly or rightly say how old she was, not being any judge of years on a woman, but I'd guess she was 15 or 16, and the prettiest thing I ever put an eye to. Pa had told us a time or two about those Spanish dons and those senoritas who lived around Santa Fe, and these folks must have been heading that direction. Right then I had me an idea. In Indian country, the more rifles the better, and this here outfit must muster 40 rifles if there was one. No Indian was going to tackle that bunch for the small amount of loot those wagons promised. The 4 of us would make their party that much stronger and would put us right in the country where we were headed for. Saying nothing to Sunday or Roundtree, I went into the dining room. The grub there was passing fine. Situated on the rails, they could get along about what they wanted, and the drover's cottage was all set up to cater to cattlemen and cattle buyers with money to spend. Later on, folks from back east told me some of the finest meals they ever sat down to were in some of those western hotels, and some of the worst too. The Don was sitting at the table with that pretty girl, but right away I could see this was no setup to buck if a man was hunting trouble. There were buckskin-clad riders sitting at tables and around them, and when I approached the Don, 4 of them came out of their chairs like they had springs in their pants, and they stood as if awaiting a signal. "Sir," I said, "from the look of your outfit, you'll be headed for Santa Fe. My partners and me, there are 4 of us, we're headed west. If we could ride along with your party, we'd add 4 rifles to your strength, and it would be safer for us." He looked at me out of cold eyes from a still face. His mustache was beautifully white, his skin a pale tan, his eyes brown and steady. He started to speak, but the girl interrupted and seemed to be explaining something to him. But there was no doubt about his answer. She looked up at me. "I'm sorry, sir, but my grandfather says it will be impossible." "I'm sorry, too," I said. "But if he would like to check up on our character, he could ask Mr. Belden over there." She explained, and the old man glanced at Mr. Belden across the room, and there was a moment when I thought he might change his mind, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry." She looked like she really was sorry. "My grandfather is a very positive man." She hesitated, and then she said, "We have been warned that we may be attacked by some of your people." I bowed. More than likely it was mighty awkward. It was the first time I ever bowed to anybody, but it seemed the thing to do. "My name is Tyrell Sackett, and if ever we can be of help, my friends and I are at your service." I meant it too, although that speech was right out of a book I'd heard read one time, and it made quite an impression on me. I mean, "I'll sure come a frogging if you're in trouble." She smiled at me mighty pretty, and I turned away from that table with my head whirling like somebody had hit me with a whiffletree. Orrin had come in, and he was sitting up to the table with that blonde girl and her father. But the way those two glared at me, you'd have sworn I robbed a hen roost. Coming down off the steps, I got a glimpse into that wagon the girl had been riding in. You'd never see the like. It was all plush and pretty, and fixed up like nothing you ever saw, a regular little room for her. The second wagon was the old man's, and later I learned that the third carted supplies for them, fine food and such, with extra rifles, ammunition, and clothing. The 3 freight wagons were heavy loaded for their rancho in New Mexico. Orrin followed me outside. How did you get to know Don Luis? Is that his name? I just up and talked to him. Pritz tells me he's not well thought of by his neighbors. Orrin lowered his voice. Fact is, Tyrell, they're getting an outfit together to drive him out. Is that Pritz? That fellow you've been talking to? Jonathan Pritz and his daughter Laura. Mighty fine New England people. He's a town site developer. She wasn't pleased to come west and leave their fine home behind and all their fine friends, but her pa felt it his duty to come west and open up the country for the right people. Now, something about that didn't sound right to me, nor did it sound right to Orrin. Remembering how my own skull was buzzing over that Spanish girl, I figured he must have it the same way over that narrow between the eyes blonde girl. Seems to me, Orrin, that most folks don't leave home unless they figure to gain by it. We're going west because we can't make a living on an Side Hill farm, and I reckon you'll find Jonathan Prince ain't much different. Orrin was shocked. Oh, no, nothing like that. He was a big man where he came from, and if he'd stayed there, he would be running for the Senate right now. Seems to me, I said, somebody has told you a mighty lot about her fine friends and her fine home. If he does any developing, it won't be from goodness of his heart, but because there's money to be had. You don't understand, Tyrell. These are fine people. You should get acquainted. We'll have little time for people out west rounding up cows. Orrin looked mighty uncomfortable. Mr. Pritz has offered me a job running his outfit. Plans to develop town sites and the like. And there's a lot of Spanish grants that will be opened to settlement. He's got some men? A dozen now, more later. I met one of them. Fedderson. With a scarred lip? Why, sure. Orrin looked at me mighty curious. Do you know him? And for the first time, I told Orrin about the shindig back for the saloon where I belted Reed Carney with the bucket. Why then, Orrin said quietly, I won't take the job. I'll tell Mr. Pritz about Fedderson, too. He paused. Although I'd like to keep track of Laura. Since when have you started chasing girls? Seems to me they always chase after you. Laura's different. I never knew a city girl before, and she's mighty fine, manners and all. Right then it seemed to me that if he never saw them again, it would be too soon, and all those fancy city manners and city fixin' had turned Orrin's head. Another thing, Jonathan Pritz was talking about those Spanish land grants that would be open to settlement. It set me to wondering just what would happen to those Spanish folks who owned the grants. Sizing up those riders of the Dons, I figured no rawhide outfit made up of the likes of Fedderson would have much chance shaking the Dons loose from their land. But that was no business of ours. Starting tomorrow, we were wild cow hunters. Anyway, Orrin was 6 years older than me, and he had always had luck with girls, and no girl ever paid me much mind. So I was sure in no position to tell him. This Laura Pritz was a pretty thing. No taking that away from her. Nonetheless, I couldn't get that contrary, hammer-headed roan out of my mind. They surely did favor. Orrin had gone back into the cottage, and I walked to the edge of the street. Several of the Don's riders were loafing near their wagons, and it was mighty quiet. And round she spoke from the street. Watch yourself, Ty. Turning, I looked around. Reed Carney was coming up the street.